I Googled Frank when I was asked to present this lecture. I didn't find all that much on the internet, so I started asking people. And everyone had the same story, which was that Frank was, of course, a Republican, of course, an opponent, an enemy of colonialism and British occupation in Ireland, but that he knew not only that the world was round, but that the issues that face the people in an occupied country are not entirely separate and distinct from issues that confront working people everywhere, even in the occupation metropolis itself. In other words, Frank saw that politics was a multi-dimensional, multi-layered thing. Yes, the national question in Ireland, inevitably, in the times in which he lived, was the principal, main question. But the people who lived here needed houses also. They needed jobs also. They needed community, sinews to be strengthened and built. And so he saw politics with a wholeness which not every person in the nationalist and Republican movement did. Somebody said to me, as Harry just said, that he walked in the tradition of Larkin and Conway, and that would have been more than good enough for me. Somebody said, well, he was a fella a bit like you, and I'm very proud that they thought that. So I'm here tonight principally to honour the memory of Frank and the contribution that he made and the footsteps that he left behind him, not only in his wonderful family, but in the fact that so many of you have given up your Saturday evening, and for 22 years now, to remember him. Not everyone leaves such footprints, and it's a great tribute to him that he has. The second reason I'm here is because I absolutely love this mill, for a whole number of reasons. My maternal grandparents came from here, in fact, moved from Longford to Belfast for a variety of reasons, and got on the cattle boats to Anderston Quay in Glasgow, arriving in their bare feet with the cattle and moving through the prejudice of the host country from Anderston Quay, walked the 80 miles, the road and the miles to Dundee, to live in the Irish immigrant quarter known as Tipperary, Lochee, and they worked all of their lives, all of them, all my maternal family worked all of their lives in mills, just like this one, jute mills and flax mills. And indeed my own first job upon leaving school was in one of those mills. So I have a soft spot for mills, though not for mill owners. The poet of the Dundee mill worker was a woman called Mary Brooksbank, and she wrote many wonderful poems and songs about the mill workers. And a couplet or two from one of her great poems is always in my mind, and indeed I've used it many times. She said, "Oh dear me, the world's ill-divided. Them that work the hardest are the least provided. Shifting bobbins, coarse and fine, they fairly make you work for your 10 and 9. 10 shillings and 9 pence from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening, and a half day on Saturday, when you could then enjoy the benefactor's provision of a library and a swimming pool and a little park, just so as you could be fit to turn up for work at 6 again on the Monday morning. These people drew vast profits from the sweat on the brows of my ancestors and the ancestors who worked here in this mill. Like much of capitalism, it has fallen into disrepair, and many of these mills are now derelict and gone. But thanks to the people who run this project, this mill has been saved, recovered, and turned into something beautiful, some of which I was able to enjoy this afternoon, where people were gathering here in a fine restaurant, were shopping or selling here in a wonderful little market, and there were people of all kinds, working people of all kinds, which is another of the themes that I wish to develop in the course of what I have to say this evening, because I believe that this is the way that Frank Cahill also saw the world. There were people here today from the Shankill. I hope I don't put them in trouble by saying so. One of them got her picture taken with me. I'm not sure she should put it on Facebook. But they were working here as sisters, rubbing shoulders with women from West Belfast, and seeing up close and personal that between working people, false dichotomies, as Marx put it, fake differences, should not be drawn. And it is the false consciousness that the powerful, the rulers, seek to imbue in people that makes working people see their interests differently. And we've had a very good example of that here in Belfast over the last 48 hours, indeed over this summer, as most summers we see it in all its ugliness and bathos. And before I develop that point further, let me tell an anecdote which has always remained with me. Long before I was myself a member of Parliament, I was a Labour organiser. I was very proud to be a Labour organiser, even though I had always many differences with the leadership of the Labour Party. But I always did my duty. And one of those duties in 1978 was to go and work full-time in Glasgow in an absolutely seminal by-election called the Garscaden by-election, in which Labour was being challenged by the then, at that point, insurgent SNP. There's a place in Garscaden called Drumchapel, which, as Billy Connolly described it, was a desert with windows. And it was a very good description. Practically everybody on the estate at that time was either poor or unemployed, and therefore desperately poor. And some of them were so poor they would constitute what Marx described as the lumpen proletariat, the very bottom level of workers who were not only materially poor but culturally and socially poor and disintegrated. And I was working in up the hill in Drumchapel, for those who know Glasgow, which is a very lumpen area. And they sent me canvassing. And I knocked on a door. And a man came to the door opened. The smell from the house was overwhelming, hit me like a blow. There were at least 3 dogs in the house. It was a bit like that scene in The Commitments where there's a horse in the kitchen. Bare floorboards, naked and half-naked children absolutely no furniture on view from the door. The man of the house came to the door, and his arse was literally hanging out of his trousers. And he had, like Rab C. Nesbitt, a dirty string vest, if you remember those. I never wore one myself. A string vest that clearly hadn't seen soap and water, neither had he, for some days. And I said to him the following: I'm calling on behalf of the Labour Party, the Labour candidate Donald Dewar, standing in the by-election on blah, blah, blah. Wondered if we could count on your support. And he put his shoulders back with his big beer belly and said, I'm a Conservative and Unionist. And it was the accentuation of the word Unionist that told me in an instant why such a man, for whom capitalism and the Conservatives and the system that they stood for had done so little, but they could absolutely count on his support. I'm a Conservative and Unionist. And that's the false consciousness that we have seen displayed this summer here and every summer really here. The so-called loyalist, Protestant, working class people, poor people in this city and other cities in the north, identifying with a flag which has done nothing for them, will never do anything for them, carrying in their hearts a foreign queen who will never invite them to a garden party. In fact, she'd run a mile at the very sight of them. This false consciousness of an identification with an economic and political system which has marginalized them every bit or almost every bit as much as it has marginalized the working people of the nationalist community of the north. And for many, it is simply unbelievable that such people who have gained so little and never will gain anything at all from their allegiance and their loyalty. As a matter of fact, the more they're on the news, the more the British avert their eyes. Trust me on that. I'm sure the Queen averts her eyes. That such people should continue to be ready to give their blood, take the blood of others 56 police officers just last evening. For what? For a flag, the Jolly Roger, which has fluttered across so many crimes over so many hundreds of years, not just here in Ireland, but across the empire. And I thank God every day that my own family, partly because of its origin here in the first of the colonies, that I was brought up to hate imperialism so much that I practically have a neuralgic, allergic reaction when I see that flag that they are fighting for. I thank God for that. My own daughter was about to give birth to her fourth child any minute. When she was a child at school, told the class and the teacher that this flag that the teacher had put up on a wall to describe it and how it came about was known in her house as the butcher's apron, blue and white and spattered with the blood of many peoples around the world, in James Connolly's immortal words. The teacher must have been quite progressive because she didn't get suspended or sent home. But the fact that she, as a 9-year-old, had the courage to so describe it is a matter of pride for me. And this concept of the British Empire is such an object of rage for me that it informs and has informed all of my life, my own politics. My Irish grandfather, Thomas O'Reilly, lived and worked all of his life in a mill like this. He was a communist and a Republican and a Catholic. I don't know how you square the circle there, but that's what he would have described himself as. Every year at the new year, he would describe to me the death of James Conway with tears in his eyes. Every year, regular as clockwork, he would describe James Conway, who lived near us for a time in St. Mary's Lane in Lochee, in that Tipperary quarter. He would use Hugh McDermott's description of Conway as Scots steel tempered with Irish fire, as a source of great pride in our Scottish-Irish heritage. And once I came home and told him that my teacher had said that Britain had an empire so huge that upon it the sun never set. And he said, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark. And I never had any cause to doubt him. And now that I have sat for 26 years, elected 6 times in 4 constituencies in 2 countries, Scotland and England, in the epicenter of that empire, when I receive visitors, my first words always are, welcome to the scene of many crimes. From that building, small building, in the capital of a small country, 1/3 of the entire land mass of the earth was ruled in the lifetime of the oldest people still alive today. And nearly 30% of the population of the world was ruled from there. And such an empire, organized for the benefit of such a small country, could only conceivably succeed if the peoples of that empire could be divided in order to be ruled. And that's exactly what has been happening here for hundreds of years. The people, the Irish people, have been divided in order that they can be ruled, as the peoples of India and many other places were ruled. The British ruled India at a time when it had a population of 600 million people by 40,000 Britishers in the military and civil service, in the service of the empire. And of course, the consequences of their policy of divide and rule can still be seen in the Indian subcontinent today. This religious group is played off against that religious group, and a third religious group is invited to entertain the hope, the possibility that they will be favored one day, chopping and changing allegiances, constantly throwing sand in the eyes of the local colonized people. The empire built treasures, a mountain of them, and the British ruling elite lived high on the hog for centuries on the proceeds of that empire. So imperialism is critical to my own political makeup. Some people say it's a difficult word. It's an old-fashioned word. And maybe it is, though no one has come up with a better one. It may be a difficult word, but it's not a difficult concept. And George Orwell, in his first novel, Burmese Days, which was drawing on his experience as a British colonial official in Burma, defined it in blindingly simple terms in the mouth of Jim Florey, obviously based on Orwell himself, and who is the hero of the book. In a conversation with a young woman one night, he's talking away as I am now, and he talks about imperialism, and the young woman asks, "What's imperialism?" And he answers, "It's going to other people's countries, killing them and stealing their things." Now, Marx probably wrote books that were less clear than that one sentence. It's about going to other people's countries, killing them and stealing their things. And you could add, dividing them in any way possible so that they don't ever get together and challenge your role in doing so. Now, Frank could see all of that, but he also, I believe, from everything I've heard about him, I could see something else. Namely, that crimes committed elsewhere were not separate and distinct from the crimes being committed against you. On the contrary, weakening the criminal in one place could only benefit you in your suffering and subjugation here or there. And this brings me to someone who, oddly, you might think, given how small this country of Ireland is, who is absolutely emblematic to my own life. I don't know what Frank's attitude to him was, but I can infer that it was exactly the same as mine. Che Guevara was a member of the Lynch family. Not a lot of people know that. A part of his ancestry is Irish, as is mine, as is yours. I don't know about you, but I'm quite proud of that fact. Now, Che Guevara was not a Cuban, but he went and suffered unbelievable depredation, risked his life, suffered, given his general state of health, enormously, used a military and political ability that seemed to come from nowhere, as he had no training or background in military affairs at all, to make a revolution in Cuba. He could well have fallen in Cuba and was ready at any time to do so. He did so because he believed that the framework, the pattern, or the paradigm of American imperialist rule in Latin America had to be attacked at its weakest point and broken there. And if it could be broken there, this could lead to its unraveling everywhere. He didn't ask, well, I'm not Cuban, I'm an Argentine, shouldn't I stay? What do these people have in common other than language and religion, for that matter, with me? He took an anti-imperialist stand to defeat Yankee imperialism in Cuba, and succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of the small number of revolutionary people who challenged the might of empire. Which is another lesson, thanks Harry, that Frank knew. That it's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts, it's the size of the fight in the dog that counts. Anyone looking at the fewer than 100 Cuban revolutionaries who set sail from Mexico for the first landing of the Cuban Revolution could not have imagined that such a number could prevail against a brute dictatorship with the support of all the American multinational corporations and the American state itself. But they did. Having succeeded in bringing about revolution in Cuba, Guevara could have put his feet up as the governor of the Bank of Cuba, his face and signature still on Cuban banknotes today, although how he ended up as the governor of the bank is truly extraordinary. It's said that when Fidel asked him, "What do you do? What are you?" Che answered, "I'm a communist." And Fidel thought he said, "I'm an economist," and put him in charge of the Bank of Cuba. But he could have lived well there. But he decided that though he was not an African, even less than he was a Cuban, though he was not an African, that the struggle led by the greatest of all the African leaders, a man now largely forgotten and whom I encourage you to study, Patrice Lumumba, the leader of the African Revolution in the Congo, murdered by imperialism at the age of 34, killed, it now appears from new scholarship, by the British themselves. Somebody wrote a book, there are only 22 countries in the world that Britain has not invaded. And one of the 22 was the Congo, and this new information means that book will have to be rewritten. It's now 21 and fallen. Patrice Lumumba murdered by imperialism. In the midst of that revolution, had at his side Che Guevara fighting in his boots, in his uniform, with his weapon in his hand to defend the revolution of ordinary people in the Congo. Though he was not Vietnamese, Guevara went in the same uniform and the same boots with the same weapon to Vietnam to stand beside the Vietnamese people trying to repel US imperialist invasion and occupation and partition of their country. Indeed, Guevara said, we have to give the Americans 2, 3, 4, 5 Vietnams, and if we can, we will end their hegemony in the world. And of course, Che was not a Bolivian, but he went there and died there in the most dismal, miserable of circumstances, in defeat in Bolivia. And some say still that he gave his blood in vain in Bolivia, but that can only be said by someone with no understanding of the new revolution that is taking place in Latin America, in places like Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador, and to some extent in Argentina and Brazil and elsewhere, inspired by the ideals of anti-imperialism which Guevara stood for. And he said, and it's my own rubric, that if you are incapable of trembling with indignation at any injustice visited anywhere on anyone, then you are not truly a man. And when I see around here the internationalism of the art on the murals, on the walls and so on, including the face of Che himself, I realize that that lesson has been learned here. Because it would have been easy, and may for a time have been the case, that Irish nationalism, the Republican revolutionary struggle, was narrow in focus, obscure in focus, as indeed some of the heroes of the Rising can be said to have been narrow in focus. The presence of James Connolly in the post office and in the execution chair, a man who saw life and the world just like Che Guevara, proves that in the Irish nationalist tradition there has always been this strand, which was represented in the personal form by Frank Cahill here in the north of this country. And I always want to strengthen that tradition. It has become more difficult in some places to really see what's going on. I find confusion in some places, even on the left, about some contemporary events. But if you have the right lodestar, if you analyze things in the correct way, you will always find yourself facing in the right direction. One of the tools with which we have to analyze contemporary events is by asking that traditional question, cui bono, who benefits? And let me take the situation in Syria as an example. I do so knowing that it's controversial, knowing that some of you may disagree with me, and in the hope that I shall persuade you. And sometimes, of course, we must choose between greater and lesser evils. Sometimes we are forced to ally ourselves with a group of Spartacuses that we wouldn't necessarily have chosen. Such is the case in Syria. There is what's called a revolution going on in Syria. It grew from legitimate demands of the people of Syria for freedom and democracy, against dictatorship, against the police state. Of that I'm in no doubt, and never have been in any doubt. But when that revolution attracts the support in manpower and finance and weapons and political, diplomatic and media support of the worst people in the world, you have to be capable of smelling a rat. Why, for example, if the Syrian revolution was a good thing, would Britain and the United States be supporting it? Why would Israel be supporting it? Israel, which has occupied a significant part of Syria for 60 years. Why would the reactionary feudal monarchies of the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and other places, why would they be pouring money and weapons into a revolution if it was a good revolution? Who can possibly benefit from the triumph of that revolution if these people are funding and arming it? And then you begin to analyze the character of the people fighting in that revolution. You see them cutting open people's chests and eating their hearts. I'm not making that up, neither am I encouraging you to go to YouTube and watch it, for it will turn your stomach, but that's what happened. You'll see them cutting off the heads on YouTube of priests and bishops as part of their assault on the multi-racial, multi-faith community that is Syria, which has 23 separate religious and ethnic groups within it. You begin to see the sectarian character of the Al-Qaeda fanatic, cutting-edge driving force in that revolution. And as far as I'm concerned, a revolution that has terrified all the religious minorities in Syria, a revolution supported by the worst gangs in the world, cannot be a revolution at all. And so anti-imperialism has to be the principal tool that we employ in this, as in so many other questions. Or Egypt, again confusion reigns. The Muslim Brotherhood won the election. Their presidential candidate, Mohamed Morsi, triumphed as the president of Egypt. He was given just 1 year. He made an absolute bollocks of that year. Everything, every mistake that he could have made, he made. But he won the election, and he's been overthrown by a military junta, which is supported by America, which gives $1.3 billion a year to the Egyptian military, whilst the Egyptian masses don't even have bread to eat. So, what conclusion can you draw from that? Not that we should support the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but that we will never support a military junta, a US-backed military junta which has seized power in that country. And they cannot call it a coup, for if it were a coup, the US government could not continue to give the $1.3 billion a year. So we have to be clear in how we approach these questions. I want to move back home to Ireland, to the Ballymurphy estate. I spent the afternoon with some fine people, the sons and the daughters, the brothers and the sisters of those who fell in another bloody crime of British imperialism in Ireland. It was a harrowing afternoon in many ways. There were 11 martyrs, one of whose death anniversary is this day, others yesterday, some tomorrow. It's particularly hard to bear because not many people know about that massacre. Even in Ireland, it has nothing like the traction, the salience, the importance of the Bloody Sunday massacre, which happened almost contemporaneously. Some of the sordid details of who was shot, how they were shot, where they were shot, is very hard to bear. And I shed a tear myself, as did my wife, at the significant places where these martyrs fell. One stands out, many stand out. Death of a priest waving a white handkerchief. Young people wounded and then executed in the back of their heads, behind their ears, with a Browning pistol, obviously by an officer of the Crown in the 1970s, in the lifetime of at least half of the people here, in broad daylight in August in 1971. But I want to focus on one of those, with no disrespect at all to the other 10. A woman called Mrs. Connolly, a woman called Mrs. Connolly, who was killed because she went to the aid of the first young boy that had been shot in what we must now send around the world as the Ballymurphy Massacre. She wasn't shot once. She was shot twice, 3 times, I think perhaps 4 times. The first shot blew away half of her face, took out her eye. She was blinded. The second shot knocked her over a hedge. She got up again. The third shot knocked her over a fence. And still she would have survived, it's now clear, if medical attention had been given. But of course, medical attention was the last thing on the minds of the murderers in red berets of the paratroop battalions 1, 2, and 3 that were massacring people in Ballymurphy that day. A woman of 44 with, I think, 8 or 9 children. One of the most poignant things about the memorials that we visited was the sheer size of the families involved and thus bereft as a result of that series of murders. A father of 13, a mother of 8 or 9, a brother of 7 or 8. So that almost 60 children were left orphaned by these murders, and hundreds of grandchildren never saw their uncles, aunts, grandmothers, grandfathers, because they were murdered here by these killers in the parachute regiment. But in a twist of fate that would be funny if it was not so dismally tragic, of course they had to explain away. How could they explain having murdered a 44-year-old woman, leaving all these children without a mother, and moreover shooting her 3 separate times? The British Army's answer, and 4 soldiers, by the way, admit to having shot Mrs. Connolly. 4 separate soldiers. They said that she was firing at them with a Bren gun. Now I know the IRA was shot in 1971, but they weren't putting up 44-year-old mothers of 8 onto the field with Bren guns. And of course there was no Bren gun. There were no shell cases. There was no gunpowder trace on the hands of any of these victims, for none of them had weapons. None of them were firing. It's all a big lie. But it was a lie that has, until now at least, been allowed to persist. Neither Mrs. Connolly nor any of the others were anything other than murdered in cold blood by agents of the British state. And I give you my word this evening, as I did to the relatives this afternoon, that as long as God gives me breath, I will make sure that the Ballymurphy massacre travels around the world until we bring the people responsible for it. And I give the parachute regiment fair warning: when I'm fighting for something, people usually know it. I intend, when Parliament returns, to highlight this case. I have participated with friends of mine here today in the making of an important documentary which will be premiered in Derry in November, an occasion which I hope to attend. I'll take this case everywhere that I can, on television, radio, on platforms like these, in Parliament, on the streets. I'll make sure that everybody knows that which currently too few people know, that what happened here these days, these 3 days, 36 hours in fact, in August of 1971, was just another of the horrific, heinous crimes committed by the British Empire in Ireland. Now, I've supported the Irish Republican cause all of my life, since I was a child. I shall always do so, even though I believe that mistakes were made in the course of that struggle. I believe that now most of these mistakes have been corrected. I don't believe, and neither did Frank Cahill, that the cause of Labour and the cause of national liberation are separate causes, but that they are one and the same. They are two sides of the same coin. So I'm really glad. I hope one day I see that he was saying so himself just the other day. I hope that Gerry Adams, a comrade of mine for many decades, I hope one day he is the power in the whole island of Ireland. But if he were to use that power just to run up a green flag and change nothing about the material lives of the mass of the working people on this island, then that would be a disappointment to me. Because there are many countries in the world that were colonized and became free and changed little, and the lives of their people remain miserable today. I believe that Frank knew that. He knew that synthesis between these different strands was something for which we must strive, which is why I'm proud to have delivered the 22nd of his memorial lectures. Thank you very much.